Okay, so 56%, only 56% of threats are actually investigated. And when people look at those, 28% of them are legitimate. So what that means is if you had 100 incidents, perhaps 12 of them were real threats and they were uninvestigated, right? And so hopefully today, one of the things I wanted to talk about, one of the reasons is you're busy, folks, and you probably wear many hats in the organization. Security is just one of them, right? And so maybe today I want to talk about some things that maybe think, how can we make you more efficient and more effective when you're dealing with security for your organization? Oh, I need the clicker here. I should have looked for the clicker. Okay, so I want to talk about some things that are going on with the security industry and the things that Cisco is doing to try to meet that goal, making you more efficient and more effective, right? So what's one of the problems? The problem is the guys we're up against are unbelievably talented, well-funded, they've got a tolerance for boredom, they work harder than we do, right? And they keep coming up with new and innovative ways of infiltrating your system. And you'll never know exactly what they're going to think up next, right? You know, a year ago, people didn't think somebody was going to knock out a window in a hotel and rain fire down on a concert or whatever, right? But they're just relentless, and they're constantly coming up with new stuff, and they're very innovative, okay? What the problem is, every time then they come up with a new technique, what does the industry need to do? The industry needs to come up with a new response. And you're never done, right? A couple years ago, it was going to be next generation firewalls were going to solve the world's problems. Now it's kind of sandboxing, but there's going to be something more. If you're standing still in security, you're falling behind. So a reality in today's security world is there's no God box. You know, there's no easy button in security, right? What the results from that phenomenon is to do security well, you need a variety of tools and techniques. To do security comprehensively, you're going to need email security, you're going to need endpoint security, cloud security, perimeter security. You need a variety of tools and techniques to do security comprehensively. It's not just a firewall. Now, that leads to this, right? You heard Paul this morning say, you know, we did a study and we found, you know, more than half of our customers are using more than 5 different vendors to provide pieces to their comprehensive security environment. And that's a big problem. This is the world that I lived in. You know, before I came to Cisco, I was at Northwest Airlines, and this is the world I lived in, right? I had Ungerman Bass hubs, I had 3Com switches, I had Bay Networks 50 concentrators, I had IBM token ring MAUs, I had Cisco routers, I had NSE routers. It was becoming operationally nearly impossible to run that network, right? It was just unbelievable. And so what we did is we said, well, we're going to kind of adopt a strategic supplier mentality. And we chose, at the airline, we chose Cisco as our networking strategic supplier, right? Well, that's kind of where we're at from a security perspective today. And so what Cisco is trying to do to address that reality is, you know, when you've got these problems to solve, and you need these a variety of tools and techniques, there's a couple strategies that you could take, right? One is you could say, well, I've got this problem. Let's get a bunch of smart people in a room and spend 6 months and evaluate every possible nerd knob for that scenario. And the problem is as soon as you are effective at solving that problem, they just move on to a new technique, and now you got a new problem, right? So what Cisco is trying to do is build out a portfolio of industry-leading solutions where we can be that strategic supplier to you from a security perspective, right? You know, and I've got valid and strong competitors in every one of these areas, and Paul mentioned it, and I'll reiterate, right? You know, competition is great, you know, it makes everybody better, and so it's not to say that these other solutions don't work, but it's operationally inefficient at a minimum. And so what we're trying to do is build where we can be that strategic supplier. So this is the portfolio that we've built. It's a fairly comprehensive solution. I don't think we're so arrogant to think that we can do it all. But in the areas that we do choose to participate in, what I can guarantee you is when you partner with Cisco from a security perspective, you're going to get an industry-leading solution, right? You know, like I said before, somebody's always going to have a nerd knob that I don't have, but you're going to get an industry-leading solution in those areas. This is about a $2.7 billion business here within Cisco. Now, the other thing is, I talked about, you need to constantly continue to innovate, right? You need to keep up with, so one of the things, there's lots of ways of growing a business. You can build internally. If you can't build internally in time, you can partner. If you can't partner successfully, you can acquire. And so in the course of growing our business, we do make a fair number of acquisitions. And that's one of the things that I like about being this $2.7 billion business within this $50 billion behemoth, is we're constantly out evaluating what are the needs, what are the next things that our customers are going to need, and where can Cisco bring extra value. And when we need to make an acquisition, we've got the deep pockets of Cisco to go out and do that, right? So I'm really pleased with that. And in fact, as Paul mentioned, you may have seen that we just recently, in October, closed our acquisition of a company, Duo. And if you look at every piece of legislation, regulation, compliance, or whatever, every single one of them almost demands that you have a multi-factor authentication system. And so we bought the leader in that space, and we're really pleased to have them as part in the portfolio. So anyhow, now, this is the world. So Cisco's the market share leader in network security, but in a highly fragmented market, right? We've got about 10% of the market share. And so this is the world that when you've got all these problems, that you could go out and evaluate, right? But the problem is they're all like ships in the night, and nobody really knows what the other one is doing. And you've got all these solutions, and they don't really work together. And I wanted to bring an analogy to that, right? I don't know has anybody here seen or heard about the Winchester Mansion out in San Jose? If you ever get a chance to do an EBC out in Cisco or whatever, go see it. But it's really kind of an interesting thing, but it brings home the point about what happens when you don't have an architecture. So the Winchester Mansion, there was 147 builders constantly working. The Winchester, the woman had some psychological problems, things like that. But the fact of the matter is, 147 builders, no architect. And as a result of that, you end up with 65 doors that go to blank walls, 13 staircases that are abandoned, skylights that are in the floor, right? So there's value to having a vision and having an architecture where you're building this portfolio to work together. And so that's what we've done. Not only do we have industry-leading products that stand on their own individually, right? Our firewalls, we can compete for your business individually, your network admissions control system. But what we've done is not only do we have an industry-leading portfolio, but we've built integration points between them so they work together where you can get that 1 + 1 = 11 effect, right? Where, if you think about your security, how is your endpoint security augmenting maybe what your firewall can do? How is your firewall augmenting what your network admissions control system does? All these other systems have a vast amount of information, and Paul mentioned, PX Grid is kind of the enabler of that information sharing, right? But there's many, many integration points. The products stand on their own, but, like I said, they are built to work together so you can get that 1 + 1 = 11 effect. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. I set the stage for why we're doing what we're doing, right? Industry-leading portfolio of solutions built to work together in an architecture. Now, how then do you organize these technologies? If you've got all these technologies, how do you organize them? And this is the way we think about them, and perhaps this is the way you kind of think about your security. There's certain technologies that you would deploy before you are attacked, right? Things that reduce the attack surface. They make the hole smaller, right? And that's great. Things that would fall under there would be things like firewalls, network admissions control systems, those types of things, right? But the fact of the matter is, if you have an open door, they're going to find a way to attack you through that door. And so there's another set of technologies that you would deploy while you are being attacked. And those would be things like intrusion protection systems, web gateways, email gateways, those types of things. Lastly, I don't care no matter how good nobody should claim that they're going to block 100% of every threat the day it showed up, the minute it showed up, right? That's not reality. And occasionally something is going to happen. If I were to ask any one of you, I don't know what your answer would be, but if I were to ask any one of you, is there a compromised machine on your network right now? I don't know what your answer would be, but I can tell you statistically, the answer to that question is 65% of the time, there's a compromised machine on your network right now. But just because you have a compromise doesn't mean you've had a breach. And so there's another set of technologies that you would deploy after you've had some kind of a compromise so that you can identify it and remediate quickly, because just because you had a breach compromise doesn't mean you had a breach, and if you can stop it before it becomes a CNN moment, that's a win. Now, the last thing I'll say about this is just kind of how we think about it, organizing the security across the entire attack continuum. What I'll tell you is, in the past, the bulk of the investment in the security space has been in the before phase, but there's actually kind of been a shift towards the during and after phases, and that's really because it needs to address the reality of today's security environment. Your before defenses will never be 100% effective, right? They only have to be successful once, and you've got to be successful every single time. So anyhow, it's kind of, some trends that are driving what Cisco's trying to accomplish, and I just wanted to share that with you. Now, if I take it down a little bit, and some of this you saw from Paul, but I wanted to take it down even a little bit lower. So you can't go to a security conference these days without hearing about everybody's security intelligence, right? If you read everybody's data sheet, you say, oh, they're all the same. Everybody says, I've got the smartest people on the planet, right? But the fact of the matter is, there is a difference, and I just wanted to share that with you. Our security intelligence organization here at Cisco, and Paul mentioned it, is Talos. And we spend $100 million a year alone on Talos, with no expectation of revenue out of them. Why do we do that? The reason we do that is the data that Talos produces is usable by our products so that our products make better security decisions. Back to that point about making you more efficient and more effective, right? So if you can block stuff without having to intervene with a person, you're going to be better off. So anyhow, 380 researchers wake up every day that are part of your team trying to help you understand what's going on in the world, who's behaving well and who's not behaving well. A couple numbers as it relates to the size. We've got an email security solution, right? We see 35 to 40% of the world's email volume. We look at 600 billion emails per day. And that gives us some insight into the way in which people are using email in an attempt to infiltrate your systems. So we can see what their techniques are, we can see what they're doing, and we can put technology, we can, make changes to our system so that we can address those new techniques, right? 16 billion web requests, 5 billion malware queries per day. Talos is huge. As it relates to malware, and as Paul was talking about this uptick in like malicious crypto mining software and things like that, Cisco Talos, we see 1.5 million unique new malware samples per day. Unique malware samples per day. When you consider that level of innovation in the malware community, you can immediately see why signature-based antivirus systems will never be able to keep up with that level of innovation. There's no way. We need a new technique. And a lot of people are out these days, in the past, we've addressed this endpoint problem with traditional antivirus, right? And I saw a study the other day that says traditional signature-based antivirus is good at stopping somewhere between 50 and 70% of today's types of threat, right? It's not very good, and it's getting worse. And so we need a new way, and a lot of people are out evaluating what is their new endpoint strategy going to be, right? And I'll show you some technology, I'll talk about some technology to help you address that. Numbers are good. You probably saw a chart, this thing from Paul earlier. Just to put it on a bubble chart, right? This just kind of shows you the size and scope of Talos. In the security threat intelligence size, in community, size matters. And Paul used this exact slide, and the reason I like it is it just shows you that Cisco security technology, powered by the intelligence of Talos, we block about 3 threats per day for every human being on the planet. It is a big deal. Ultimately, it helps your security technology make better decisions so that you don't have to make those things, or you don't have to be bothered by those things, right? It is a big deal, but you don't buy Talos. You don't buy Talos. It's something that we do that makes our products make better, more efficient decisions, right? So anyhow, now if I bring that down even a little bit further, I talked about strategy and why we're doing some of the things that we're doing. I talked about the security intelligence that improves our efficacy of the decisions that our products are making, right? So now let's talk a little bit about some products. So if I go down, if I'm a bad guy and I want to unleash a malware campaign upon the world, it's kind of a failed strategy for me these days to use fixed IP addresses. In today's world, it'll very quickly get discovered, it'll get shut down, and then I'm out of business and I'm not making any money. And so our Telos group a while back conducted a study, and they found that 91% of all the malware they looked at uses DNS to start the process. The problem is less than 32% of organizations actually look at their DNS traffic. So you're using DNS today, right? It's core infrastructure, internet protocol. But almost every piece of malware uses DNS and almost nobody looks at it. That's a big problem. So what Cisco did is we made an acquisition of a company called OpenDNS. Perhaps you're using it. It's been, a lot of people use it in their homes and everything, right? And as for whatever reason, as Cisco feels compelled to do, after we make an acquisition, we rename it. So we renamed OpenDNS, now we call it Umbrella, right? And so I wanted to just describe some of the functionality that Umbrella gives you, right? So Umbrella started its life as just a recursive DNS service. The largest recursive DNS service in the world is Google, with about 5% of the world's DNS traffic. The second largest recursive DNS provider in the world is Umbrella, with about 4.5% of the world's DNS traffic. And this changes so frequently, I'm going to it's up to about 150 billion DNS queries per day that the Umbrella service sees, right? So it's a huge service. And there's a couple functionalities that it provides. One is I wanted to describe to you that it's fast, it's easy, it's comprehensive, and it's effective, right? So I'll address easy first. You can do nothing more than point your DNS forwarders to Umbrella. And then, obviously when the DNS requests show up at Cisco's Umbrella servers, we have to know that you're you, right? So how do we know that you're you? What you do is you can just point your DNS to us. You can tell us what your public IP address is. And if you do that, that site is cut over. And so, it's very easy to deploy at its most basic level. Now there's further integrations that you can do, right? But I'll give you a feel for how easy it can be to deploy. 140,000 people use Cisco's network every day, 180 sites around the world. Cisco IT cut over to Umbrella worldwide in 60 minutes, and nobody even knew that we did it, all right? That's huge. Now, the other thing is Cisco IT actually did a case study about the deployment. They actually wrote up some of the benefits to the company. And one of the unexpected outcomes of cutting over to Umbrella is the performance of our web browsing company-wide improved. Because as far as fast goes, I've seen the statistics anywhere short of Latin America, we're the lowest latency DNS resolvers out there. And so how many times can you say you deployed an effective security tool and at the same time you improve the performance of the company, right? So it's fast, it's easy, it's comprehensive because there's a client piece. Even when the user goes out and about, when they go home or they go to Starbucks or whatever, there's a little component of our AnyConnect client that can intercept those DNS requests and send them through the Umbrella service as well. So you can cover, corporate office, remote office, teleworker, road warrior, all with one solution, right? And as far as effective goes, there's a couple functionalities. One is prevention, right? So if your user, for whatever reason, tries to go to www.malware.com, based on our prediction, we can know that we shouldn't resolve that DNS request. It's going to do bad things for that user, right? And so don't even let the user go there. We know it's going to deliver some bad stuff. That's called prevention. There's also containment. A lot of today's malware calls home to the mothership, looking for encryption keys or whatever, right? And so even though maybe the machine may already be infected, when it reaches out to that criminal infrastructure, it usually uses DNS to do that as well, and we can see that and we can block it, right? That's called containment. We also can do the legal liability productivity stuff. Don't let people go to porn sites type of a thing, right? So you can address the prevention, the containment, and I was gonna mention Kayla, but I didn't. So now, prevention, containment, legal liability, productivity. So it's very, very effective. The other thing I wanted to just show you is, as far as effectiveness goes, this doesn't happen every time, but I want to show you that this is possible, right? If I'm a bad guy and I want to unleash a malware campaign upon the world, what are some things that I would have to do before I let it go? Well, one of the things that I'd have to do is I'd have to build out the infrastructure that's going to deliver it, right? And much like you can drive around your city and you kind of know the bad neighborhoods of the city, Umbrella already kind of knows the bad neighborhoods of the internet, okay? So we kind of have that knowledge already based on Talos, right? The other thing I'd have to do is I'd have to test it. I'd have to make sure there's not some fatal flaw in my code, and then if it's not gonna work, then I'm not gonna make any money either. And so because of the number of DNS requests that we see every day, a lot of times we can see that testing activity occurring, right? Well, here's what can result from that, right? There was a ransomware campaign, Locky. In this case, it was delivered through tedboxers.com. And because of the relationships and the activity and the history of tedboxers.com, Umbrella was able to flag that as a malicious domain, I think on like September 28th, okay? But you can visually see that campaign did not hit the world until October 8th. So in that scenario, Umbrella was able to protect your organization 11 days before the campaign even hit the world. Now, I'm not saying that happens every time, but what I am saying is it's possible based on the intelligence that we have, the predictive analytics that we have, and things like that. It's really kind of an effective thing. Now, I started this whole thing saying that I wanted to help try to make you more efficient and more effective, right? Effective based on Talos is intelligent, but efficient means less number of events that you actually have to investigate. So this is a real study of what our customers who have deployed Umbrella have seen. A 90% reduction in malware on their network. But even a bigger point is a 50% reduction in the number of alerts that their other security technologies were informing them about, right? And so, if you think about your firewall is like a lock on the door. The way I think about Umbrella is it's your first line of defense. It's kind of like the beat cops that pulled the criminals over, 10 blocks away from the bank because they had expired tabs. They didn't even get close to the bank, right? So it's kind of that first line of defense. If you do that and you weed out a whole bunch of garbage at the DNS layer, you don't have to fight every fight at your firewall, right? You can weed out a whole bunch of garbage. You can improve the performance of your company. It's all the less things that your firewall and your antivirus and all that stuff has to look at, right? But ultimately, it can't be perfect. It's not 100%. So ultimately, you do need a firewall. And so, I was going to talk about this in the next generation firewall, but we only have a half an hour. I did want to share, as far as the effectiveness goes, a lot of you have deployed IPS, or maybe 10 years ago you deployed IPS. And one of the problems that we encountered when we were deploying the first generation of IPS is there were so many events and so many false positives that people quit looking at it, right? Like anybody's IPS could go out and tell you that you got attacked 1,000 times yesterday. If I went and told most of my customers that you've been attacked 1,000 times yesterday, it'd probably last about a day and you'd never look at it again, right? So what I wanted to share with you is IPS has improved. And if you had a bad experience the first time, give it another shot, because what our IPS does now is we learn. What is it like to be your network? So we learn your OSs, we learn your apps, we learn the version of those apps, dynamically, by the way, no agent. And if I understand those things from a security perspective, what also do I know? I know the vulnerabilities that exist in those apps, and I know the threats that would exploit them. So what our IPS does is when it sees a threat, it compares that threat to how relevant is it to the victim that is being attacked, and it presents that back to you in the form of what are called impact flags. And I'll just give you an example. If I saw somebody trying to exploit a Windows vulnerability, but I looked at the victim and I knew that the victim was a Linux box, that would be like an impact flag 3. It might be interesting to know that you were attacked that way, but don't spend a lot of time researching that, right? So like I said, while anybody's IPS could tell you got attacked 1,000 times yesterday, our IPS might say, well, yeah, you were attacked 1,000 times yesterday, but maybe only 2 of them were actually relevant to the victim that was being attacked. Dramatic reduction in the noise that you would have to deal with. All the less things, so I'm gonna skip through this. Now, if you think about IPS, it's kind of packet-based threats, right? But what about those file-based threats? What about the things we have used antivirus in the past for? And antivirus is failing us, right, generally. It's good at stopping the known bad threats that have been around forever. There's a place in the world for antivirus, but it's not good enough these days. And so we've got a new technology, it's called AMP, Advanced Malware Protection. And there's 3 main components to the AMP technology. First is detection, right? You gotta have a plan A. Plan A is stop the bad stuff, right? But I told you when we started, no one had better claim that they can stop every single thing the day it shows up. So you got to have plan B as well, right? So what if something shows up on your network that nobody's ever seen before in the world? There's also a sandboxing component where you can submit that to our virtual sandbox. We can execute in a virtual environment. We can observe its behavior. And then the last piece is there's this retrospective nature of AMP. If some unknown threat ever showed up on your network and maybe did a little bit of damage, what's the universal first question that executive leadership would ever ask of you? And it's like, well, how did that happen, right? And so there's a retrospective nature to AMP as well, where we can go back in time and we can tell you exactly how it came in, what it did, who was affected. And so there's three main components to AMP. There's detection, there's sandboxing, there's retrospection, right? The nice thing about Cisco and what we can do at Cisco is we have a strategy here called AMP Everywhere. And what that's all about is the technology, AMP, powered by Talos, we could put in your firewall. We can put in your email gateway. We can put in our Meraki equipment. We can put in the routers. Ultimately, we can also put that on the endpoint. Now, why do we do that? The reason we do that is all those different places have a slightly different perspective on the world. You know, if a file came in over FTP and your firewall saw it was malware and discarded it, great. But what if that file came in over a TLS encrypted email? You know, your firewall wouldn't see it, but your mail gateway would, right? Ultimately, what if that malware was introduced to the laptop via a flash disk or while they were at Starbucks, right? And so we can put AMP in all those different places to get you the broadest coverage from the most threats, because you're not going to put AMP on those IoT devices, right? So if you can detect and discard that out at the network level, that's all the better, right? So ultimately, that leads us to an endpoint thing. You know, I told you the Cisco business, about a $2.7 billion business. The biggest part of that is firewall-related stuff. The two fastest growing products in the whole portfolio are Umbrella as your first line of defense, and then AMP on the endpoint as your last line of defense, right? And so, you know, we've got a variety of different engines to detect malware, new types of malware, right? We've got a hash-based engine. If we've seen it before, we can detect it, we can discard it. And based on the vast majority of your stuff is going to get stopped purely because you're probably not the first one that's ever encountered it, right? But we also have an Ethos engine. That engine, what that does is, what if, you know, it just checks certain headers of a file. And maybe you can detect entire classes of malware that were written by that same tool, right? That's actually called an Ethos engine. You know, the Spiro engine is a machine learning engine. You know, if you saw 5 pieces of malware and they all shared 10 common attributes, the next time you saw a file that had those 10 common attributes, odds are it's going to be malware. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably going to be a duck. That's our Spiro machine learning engine. We've got a map engine. That's something that specifically looks for the behavior that ransomware tends to exhibit. We've got an exploit prevention engine for that file-less malware. We've got a system protection engine for the tools that try to like steal passwords and things like that. And ultimately, we have an AV engine as well. So I just wanted to share with you, we do have a new way of protecting those endpoints as your last line of defense. It's called AMP. It's powered by the intelligence of Talos. And there is a new way, and it's much more effective. The last thing I wanted to share with you, and I'm running just a tad long, is do you have a mouse in your attic? And the answer is you never know unless you went and looked, right? And so nobody knows more about what's going on your network than your network. And the network, that data can be produced in the form of NetFlow records. Now, a human being is not going to be able to look at 100,000 NetFlow records every day and actually turn it into anything meaningful. And a lot of people, even if a lot of people, this data goes to waste. They're not looking at it at all. But even some of the people that are taking their NetFlow data, they're typically taking it in for the purposes of capacity planning. But you can imagine that this data could be used from a security perspective as well, right? And so we've got a tool, it's called Stealthwatch. It uses the data that your tool already, that your network already can produce. We run it into a flow collector, and then there's a management console as well. And what it has the ability to do is take those thousands of events that are showing up on your network every day, right? But actually turning it into alarms. So I'll give you an example. If I saw a machine go do a port scan of that computer over here, and then it didn't do anything for 2 more days, and then it did a port scan of this machine over here, and then it didn't do anything, and now it did. Every time we see an event, the Stealthwatch system adds concern index points to that thing, and eventually it's going to bubble up to become an alarm. So again, it's a dramatic reduction in the number of events that you have to look at because you're only kind of dealing with the alarms. And there's a variety. It baselines your network, does a bunch of things. One example is you can't hear a Stealthwatch conversation without hearing about the data hoarding rule. There's a company that uses Stealthwatch that claims with a high degree of certainty they can detect when an employee is just about ready to leave the company. Because what happens is the data hoarding rule, normally Bob doesn't take 2 gigs of data off that server, right? But all of a sudden he is, he's gathering up all this data with the intention of taking it to his next employer. So anyhow, it's kind of dramatic. It's a dashboard to look holistically across the activities of your entire network. Your firewall can do a lot of this stuff at the perimeter, but what about all that east-west stuff that's running around? Now, the last component that I wanted to talk about, and Paul talked about it this morning, encrypted traffic analytics, right? Maybe 75% of the stuff running around your network right now is encrypted. And we certainly have technology where we can pop open encrypted sessions, right? But there's so many ramifications doing it. There's legal, there's performance, there's trust issues, right? Wouldn't it be nirvana if we could detect malware inside of an encrypted session without actually having to decrypt the traffic? Now, I'm a dual CCIE, I'm a fairly technical guy. We came out with this thing called encrypted traffic analytics where we said, hey, with a high degree of probability, we can detect malware inside of encrypted sessions without and I said, yeah, right. I don't really believe you. But you can, by the knowledge that we have about bad stuff around the internet, by the size and the sequence and frequency that packets are showing up, that tells us something, right? Anyhow, the point is, initially I didn't believe it. There's a paper out there that talks about how it works, and it actually can, and the proof's in the pudding. So I just wanted to end ETA with this thing. We actually put ETA to the test. And a couple things that I wanted to share. We set it up at the RSA conference. The first thing I wanted to share, notice 82% of the traffic running around the RSA conference was encrypted. So this ought to scare the heck out of a security guy, right? More and more of the traffic running around your network is encrypted. And a lot of security guys are so concerned about, well, how much malware is running around my network that's encrypted? At the RSA conference, 82% of the traffic was encrypted. However, ETA was able to detect 180 detections of malware without decrypting those sessions, right? That's the RSA conference. We deployed it at the Mobile World Congress. Again, 85% of traffic was HTTPS, 300 malware detections using ETA. And the last one is at Cisco Live in Orlando, 400 detections at ETA. Again, in the 80% of encrypted. So it actually can be done. It uses the telemetry of your network to enable this. There's 2 enablers of ETA. One enabler is enhanced net flow, so you need an infrastructure that can produce enhanced net flow records. But the second enabler of ETA is the Stealthwatch system that actually turns it into something meaningful, right? So I just wanted to share with you a couple things, strategy, what we're trying to accomplish, why we're doing it. Some of the things that makes our technology more efficient, and I wanted to expose you to some technologies that a lot of our customers are really excited about. So that's kind of my end of my presentation, and so I sure appreciate the time.